Om Satyanandam. Om Tat Sat. Om. Bless this convergence in all its phenomenal aspecting, seen and unseen. Om. Om. God speaking directly to God about God. The sixth teaching of SATYAVEDISM, entitled Om Satya, Medications, Drugs, Psychotropics, Psychedelics, Nootropics, Lssv 6. Om. This teaching, due to scientific nature, is hereby declared updatable, abrogatable, supersedable by subsequent teachings. Om. The following God information does not serve as a replacement for God in the form of official medical and legal information and assistance. Om. Neither is their intent to encourage the use of currently illegal substances and thus illegal behavior in fiction. And as such, there is no liability in fiction. Om. This teaching is expansive and inclusive of purification and dehypnotization, deconstruction of fictional reality, the use of various substances, and what is the core root of these behaviors or behavioring phenomenon in fiction. In fiction, Om, what is called social and legal, the implications and ramifications of such usage. And then the evolving to overstand and treat these ramifications God absolutely, not with ignorance. There is to be some technical jargoning, but this transmission is still, as all transmissions are, in God Lang. Om. Om. The purification and dehypnotization is toward what is already existing, which is God absolute reality, with no projectioning. Now, Om, all the substances, classifications just referred to are God manifested and are God. So there is no distinctioning between what are called natural substances found in, quote, nature, unquote, which is God nature, or nature being another word for God, manifestation. And what are termed as unnatural, or again, species-made substances that are not direct from nature. But this distinction, again, is false, because all of these various substances are, in fact, God natural. It is this distinctioning can only be about whether they are helpful or aid and assist the health of seeming body hallucination forms. So in that respect, they can be distinguished to some extent. Also, what is considered the intent of such substances needs to be taken into consideration. So the substances in and of themselves as God are neither helpful nor harmful in absolute reality. And as for the legality or non-legality of substances that are natural and are God nature, that in fiction are distinguishable as either, again, legal or illegal. This is to be addressed. Now, the teaching, the dietary guidelines of SATYAVEDISM, which is Lssv 73 to refer to, goes into the usages and the withdrawal from certain substances in a phase of the veganism that is called clean veganism, which involves detoxification of the body, purification of the body form that is seen as apparent in relativity, so to speak, in God Absolute. So it goes into and enumerates nutritional vitamins and supplements that are to be added because they are food and proper for ingestion to be converted into body form. And the elimination of other substances that are actually in some ways detrimental to the body form and functioning and the brain functioning. Some of these substances, although they are legal in fiction, they've been deemed legal and helpful, have actually, there is actual scientific information that indicates that ultimately they are not helpful, and these substances are not healthy for protracted periods of time in eternity, seemingly. They can have very detrimental effects on organ functioning and overall systematic functioning, as well as cognitive functioning. And so they become, through continuous use, toxic. And there are all sorts of other effects that would be deemed psychological that are not gone into in that particular teaching, because it centers around detoxification of body and mind, and does not go into what are called sociological ramifications in fiction about use of these substances and how the usage ultimately deters from the core problematics basically these substances are palliative. They to relieve symptoms of illness, but do not go to the core of the seeming problem. In other words, keep asleep functioning within the ignorance fiction, within the dreaming. So they seem to be helpful within that dreaming, because the object of it is to take seeming upsetness and malfunctioning within that system and reintegrate it back into what is considered normal functioning, which actually is illness in absolute reality. So this is not the way toward self-realization and God realization. It's the reverse. So the elimination of certain substances, again, psychiatric medications, to reduce to a bare minimum or eliminate entirely, and this will be expounded upon. But some of the more normal substances are to be eliminated completely, such as alcohol and cigarettes, nicotine, caffeinated beverages, etc., containing caffeine. In other words, stimulants, various stimulants and depressants, because there becomes a dependency upon them, and especially when they're combined in conjunction, in other words, and it throws the body system functioning basically out of whack to become unnatural functioning that needs these substances to keep this functioning that seems desirable, to keep that going, to perpetuate it. So it is not hesitant to use the word addiction, because it's completely overused and leads to not understanding that have ingestion of substances like that with dependence, that somehow or other the dependence is impossible to stop, and then there is labeling that comes with that, such as that such and such a fictional person becomes an alcoholic, or whatever the substance is becomes labeled by the substance in order and minimized to being only that, and somehow or other having an illness that is about that substance. But this is not the case. This is not truth. First of all, when there is enough God will, any substance can be stopped completely. So there is not a dependency of that kind where it's impossible to stop something, and there have to be years in eternity having a label and having cravings for such substances, and all of that basically is fiction. So when there is the self-realization or God will, any seeming habit is completely malleable and can be stopped or started at will, at God will. So dismiss the ideas of labeling, such as alcoholic and all the various other negative, detrimental labels that only serve to keep realization from self-realization from occurring, as long as there's belief in that sort of labeling, etc. and behavior that comes as a consequence of that. So these substances, again, these substances can be eliminated. They are not, the substances are actually very harmful for protracted usage, such as alcohol. It's very harmful. It may be considered for short periods of time, or when the body has even more ability in malleability and plasticity, that it seems like there isn't much harm in it, but it is accrued and effects. And there can be all sorts of, quote, psychological harm in how they're used or not. But the long-term usage of such substances affects the body deleteriously, the functioning. So it is best to eliminate them, those substances, because they are already well known to cause all sorts of illness, ultimately. And of course, those illnesses are reversible, but those illnesses are reversible through God omnipotent power to do so. So elimination of these very popular medications or self-medications takes all of the balancing and imbalancing and dependency, the actual body chemistry changes and reverts back to its natural functioning, and there are immediate it's immediately, the relief is immediate. But as long as there's dependency on those substances and no break in how they're used, there's no seeing of that. So again, that's that alcohol, nicotine, caffeine. Now, for psychiatric medications, let's take care of, let it be addressed, prescription medications. And the medications that are considered obtainable not through prescription, these have to do with seeming bodily ailments. So the body gets what is called a cold or a flu or congestion or headache, or various words to indicate the body's dis-ease in physical terms. So there's the tendency toward medication. There are all sorts of medications to procure in order to alleviate all of these physiological symptoms. And many of them are palliative. Those substances cause the symptoms to not be felt as much. Some of those substances can cure, but many of them are palliative. So the use of those substances, it basically masks what is actually the problem. For instance, a headache. or brain ache, actually, pain in the brain, is considered normal somehow in fiction. It is just considered normal. Now, one of the reasons it's considered normal is the ingestion of the alcohol and the caffeine, which actually affect the dilation of the blood vessels, etc., the vascular system of the brain. So when that vascular system is constantly being activated and disrupted in various ways that are basically unnatural, then of course there are going to be problems in the vascular blood flow to the brain. So the pervasive use of such substances has made seemingly such phenomenon as headaches normalized. They've been normalized in fiction. Now the fact is, that is not normal. That is the body saying that there is something wrong, and it has to be attended to. The body is indicating that there's a problem. This is what pain physiologically is all about. When there is pain felt in the body system, it is directly speaking. It's speaking. The pain is indicating that there is something to attend to. And the attention is not to mask the pain. This means that the pain has to be dealt with directly. So, imbibing substances in order to just mask the pain, and yes, some of the substances actually are inflammatory reduction until the next substance intake. And this creates a cycling of need for these various substances in combination. Now, the more substances get combined in such manners that, and all of these substances not being helpful, then when they're used in conjunction, it becomes even more unhealthful to the body. God in the form of Mika, Om, had to be attended to. So the more healthful the combination becomes. So with all seeming medications, one medication then is introduced in order to alleviate another symptom caused by another side effect of another medication, and so it goes and so it goes, where ultimately God in the form of some can be seen taking many pills and medications altogether and having no idea what that medicinal cocktail being ingested is actually causing ultimately. And so this is what is meant by detox. It's meant by systematically eliminating substances. Now, not all at once, and not suddenly, because that can actually cause all sorts of problems, including seizures, especially when a body has been exposed to certain substances over time and eternity. And eliminations of such substances is best with some sort of God in the form of and happening of medical advice and monitoring. Again, SATYAVEDISM stresses, it emphasizes God in the form of science, and then that in the form of medicine. Because God assists, actively assists, as God in the form of medicine. There's no distinction between the various forms of assistance. So it is best, when having used what are called psychiatric medications that have been prescribed, that if there should be reductioning and then elimination, but they should be monitored, scientifically monitored. It should not be on just suddenly stopping, because that can it could be very detrimental. So when it says, when this is about completely eliminating, there is meaning that in stages and one by one substances, as advised medically. But the goal is to not ingest those substances. Now, unless it is deemed absolutely necessary to functioning, not suggested or not in fiction culturally accepted, but if for some reason it is absolutely necessary and there's no other way to deal with it, then it would be reducing to a bare minimum. So the non-prescription medications, almost all of them are unnecessary. There are some simple ways in which this can be shown to be true. One, most seeming headaches and pains, etc., are alleviated by ingestion of enough water, clean water, not tap water or not water that has toxins, various substances that all, when combined in the water system, when that water is actually tested, it's found to have all sorts of substances at seemingly low levels, enough for it to be legal to have that water accessible and drinkable. But in fact, unfortunately, until tech is used in order to purify the water systems of the planets, there should be procuring of as much of what would be called pure or fresh water as possible. So ingesting enough of water, what is called perhaps 8 glasses of water a day, 6 to 8 glasses of water a day, can detoxify many of the ailments that are causing these problems, where there needs to be medication, procured non-prescription medication. And also in conjunction with the veganism, which clears the system of more and more toxins, and the various other non-processed foods, clean veganism and all. A lot of the toxins will leave the body naturally without having to resort to all sorts of complicated detoxification methods or cleanses or fasting, etc., some of which are helpful, but there really is not the need to resort to such techniques or to really go into them extensively when most toxins can be released by following this plan, these guidelines of veganism, and then clean veganism, and then etc. So that, in conjunction with much hydration, can alleviate most of the problems or symptoms that where there is resorting to all these medications that have, some of them have side effects and cause problems to the body, like such substances as cortisol and all, dependence on these non-prescription medications. So again, basically want to eliminate what are called recreational, normalized, legal substances that seem to help functioning even with regard to, or socially condoned in fiction, even encouraged in what is called work, in order to create more productivity. But ultimately it does not create productivity because of all the sluggishness and involved in the body, and the disruptive nature of these substances combined, disrupting sleep, the body regeneration, sleep patterns, and all manner of functioning, basically. It's that so that substance such as caffeine seems to create more productivity, but ultimately, because of all of the imbalances, this all washes out, and it actually having system be completely clear and clean of toxins, the underlying God Shakti energy just becomes completely apparent. When all of this is withdrawn, there is boundless energy that's actually that is unsurfaced and rises up and expresses itself in, say, what is called Kundalini activation and all. So eliminating these substances is actually conducive to such energetic activation. And then there is boundless energy, all sorts of energy to work. So in fiction, in society, if all of these substances were actually eliminated, there would be much more energy to get to God manifest much greatness, instead of sluggishness and recovery and the cycle of having to recover from unnatural overstimulation and all the fluctuations in bodily energy. All of that is eliminated. Now, as for prescription medications, this presents very complexly in fiction. What is considered what is necessary or normal. So what is called psychotropics or psychiatric medications. Now, without all of this ignorance phenomenon, there wouldn't even remotely be the justification for such substances, because there would be nothing to medicate. All would be health, naturally. So there's physiological health appearancing and psychological health appearancing, and all would just flow, and all the energy would just flow, and all would be healthful. But in this systemization in fiction as it is currently phenomenon, psychotropics are administered freely, and at this point there is not even considered a stigma about it. And at some point there was even freely administered psychiatric medications to God in the form of seeming of what would be called children, where the body and brain functioning and development is not even fully realized, so affecting growth and actual brain processing before full development. And somehow or other, this was considered normal, or far from. It was only indicative of the system as a phenomenon that it had come to that. So there is information now which is starting to be propagated that those usages of those medications are not suitable. They are. It is not. It is not the way to handle natural energy. The psychotropics, again, are basically palliative. They are, and relieve the symptoms of disruption. So although some may be considered helpful for what would be called very short-term use, and then the addressing of the real seeming problems and not the symptoms, but what is actually emanating. Instead of medicating the symptoms, to go deeper into the investigation and try to uncover what is actually occurring. So some of these substances, if they are used very short interval, and then taken and then ceased, there is some merit to that, although, and perhaps in certain cases, but it is best that they not be introduced at all. And certainly not for prolonged periods of time in eternity and dependency and the belief that somehow or other that these substances are helpful. Because that causes the sleeping and the dreaming to keep occurring. So this unnatural, the ignorance of this fiction, basically this is all basically illness. It is belief and delusion in a reality that is actually fantasy ultimately. Well, this collective species dreaming, causes all sorts of sickness in order to maintain itself. Now, none of this is intentional. Then there is no plot, and there's no conspiracy, and there is no keeping the, quote, masses down, and while other, God in the form of others are profiting off of it and all that. None of this is intentional. This is just the way that this has been propagated and continues to reconfigure in various forms. And it keeps happening and happening and happening and happening and happening until somehow or other there is enough God information to actually break this and have this evolve to sort of break this dreaming, break into ultimately the absolute reality and the whole. But as long as this fictional species dream is considered normal, the way it is functioning, is this unnatural constriction of that seems to be apparent in reality. So this virtual reality dream illness. So in order to continue this, when there is seemingly what from the perspective of fiction, there's disruption going on, there's unhappiness, there's some attempt at rebellion or something, somehow or other, and it needs to be medicated in order to take this malfunctioning and sort of integrate it back into what is considered the normal functioning of the fictional system. So these psychotropics are basically being prescribed in order to take the unhappiness or the various seeming activities that occur that are not conducive to the whole system and medicate them down into normalcy. So it makes sense in this fictional system, but it makes absolutely no sense in terms of God, absolute reality. So it is the sort of the antithesis of the realization of reality. Now, there are paradoxically some positive aspects to this, seemingly. So what seems to be palliative care keeps the awakening from occurring, because this all really is, this is a misunderstanding of the actual dynamics going on. So seen from the perspective of fiction, it is solving the problem because it's about reintegration back into the fiction and to stop the disruption for, quote, your own good and the good of others. But it is not the good of anything, ultimately. It keeps this dream, this dysfunctional dream going. So it only patches, it's a misunderstanding of what is actually occurring. So until the psychiatry, which is a form of pseudoscience, it's science to some extent, but past a certain point it becomes somewhat a fiction. And psychology, the psychology at least doesn't go to medicate for that. God in the form of psychology is more investigative and can go deeper than that. But that psychology, still the pervasive psychology, has to be evolved, because that is, again, it only goes so far, and then it does not diagnose properly ultimately what is actually going on. And more of that has to do with the rearranging of the various components within the dream, and how to reintegrate, and how to have optimal functioning ultimately within that paradigm that is not really reality. So so some of these substances, psychiatric medications, would be like antidepressants or anxiety, antipsychotic, stabilizers and focusers, OM. But ultimately that is not addressing the core of what is going on. What is actually going on is the beginnings of deconstruction of this pseudo-reality. That is what actually is occurring. So within the pseudo-reality, there is the, no, wait, this is not, let's get this fixed. It's okay, we'll go, just calm down, and you'll deal with this within fiction. So, but that is not truly healthful. So what's truly helpful is that this, in many cases, it's a spiritual awakening that is occurring. The deconstruction, naturally, the reality is starting, it's already being seen through to a certain extent. So the unhappiness comes from not understanding that, and feeling like that there is being stuck within something, and not being able to do anything about it, and wanting more somehow or other, and feeling alienated, or as an individual in the world without the ability to affect the world, because there's the misunderstanding that the individual and the world are somehow separate, or that the individuals and other individuals are all separate, and that they're dynamically, they can end up being dynamically opposed, or the will of this individual over that individual, or the will of the rest of the world over seeming individual will, all of which is basically illusion. So, but this dissatisfaction ultimately, somehow or other, ends up manifesting because there's a natural inclination toward truth. Somehow or other, getting to truth. Now, the underlying truth is already there. It's already here and now in eternity, and it does not go in and out of reality. It is always there and available. But as long as the pseudo personality reconfigures over and over, and in various formations or whatever, and there's belief that that is me, or that is you, or whatever, and there's belief in that, and then that there's a world, and there's this struggling with how to reconcile it, or what is this all about, or why is this, then these questions of who am I, what is the world, why are things done this way, why the seemingly injustices, and all the disgruntledness, the cynicism involved, all of these different seeming negative traits and behaviors start to manifest in reaction to all of it, in the non-understanding that all is God myself, and that there has to be this it becomes this struggle, whether seems to manifest in fiction as familial disputes or struggles or not having been loved properly, etc., and all the various narratives that come with the timeline of oneself, etc., that is not true in reality. So all of these behaviors play themselves out, and so long as there's belief in all of that, there can be all sorts of behaviors that are manifest, that then manifest themselves in physical form and illness. So mental illness, physical illness, etc., and then their effects on seeming others, and then all of that struggle basically comes down to either the pseudo-self wants to be helped and goes in for psychiatric help and medication just to be relieved of all of this, or it's seemingly imposed upon from the outside or close by, in terms of in relativity, familial pressures to educational pressures within the education system to conform to certain behaviors in order to continue to be educated, etc. All of this positing the pseudo self as being real, and as well as the other pseudo selves and all, and the various social dynamic that again is the collective fiction dream of species. So then there's either the self, the seeming pseudo self wants to be helped by taking antidepressants, etc., or stabilizers, or wants relief in various forms, whether they be prescribed or not prescribed, etc. But this condoning, this normalization of the medication in order to for seeming health that isn't really health continues. So what is actually usually going on that is not diagnosed this way is a spiritual awakening, a waking up out of the fictional constructs of this virtual reality that is not real. So this is actually, that seeming awakening is actually very healthful. So it should not be short-circuited and pushed back down. So not resorting to these medications is the best way to handle this, and also then to seek, the pseudo-personality seems to be seeking help. But what needs to happen is there needs to be common knowledge to identify this, that this is basically a spiritual awakening. So that can be handled in various ways. Within fiction, there is such phenomenon called transpersonal psychology, which is much more aware of this sort of phenomenon. And then also what is considered and becoming more apparent, shamanism, which directly addresses such illness. The phenomenon occurs and it's obvious what's going on. There isn't any hesitation or about it. It's seen right through as, oh, this is what is occurring. And then there's assistance and help in aiding to handle this in the proper manner, not to misdiagnose it in fiction. There seem to be some technical difficulties. This is to be continued in part 2 when the technical difficulties are lifted. Om.